There is a hush that comes before life turns. It is not the hush of surrender, but the quiet that arrives when a woman stops asking the world to tell her who she is. In that pause, you can hear the old machinery of approval grind to a halt, the applause fading like waves at low tide. What remains is the steady pulse beneath the noise, an awareness, ancient and new, that her worth was never a door for others to unlock. It was a house she could enter at any time, if only she trusted herself to turn the handle. In the days before that turning, everything had a louder edge. Love was a negotiation, attention a ration, presence a currency always under audit. She learned to raise her voice when she felt invisible, to sweeten the tone when she feared withdrawal, to bend when the room stiffened. It made sense for a while. The game rewarded who could anticipate the next mood, the next absence, the next promise wrapped in the silver paper of charm. But bargains stitched from fear never last. They unravel in the laundry of ordinary mornings, the unanswered text, the vague reply. The plan delayed only this once, the sudden static where clarity was promised. Each thread comes loose, and she keeps mending until her own fabric begins to thin. One evening, after a long day of smiling through grit, she turned off the lights and sat beside the window. The city hummed like an animal sleeping. Her reflection hovered on the glass, not a stranger, not exactly, but a woman half lit by the life she had been performing. In the glass, she could see a question. What if this story is not about getting them to stay, but about you deciding what you stand for? She didn't answer right away. The body remembers what the mind denies, and hers was tired from the choreography of chasing and apologizing for wanting more than crumbs. She pressed a palm to her chest. The drumbeat there didn't ask for explanations. If you had been there, you might have mistaken the moment for nothing at all, a shadow leaning toward its own breath. But it was a threshold. The difference between a demand and a standard rose up like a shoreline visible at last when the storm passes. A demand says, "Give me what I need so I can feel safe." A standard says, "This is the landscape of my life. Enter if you can honor it." A demand grabs at the other. A standard returns the self to the self. In the dim apartment, she felt that difference move through her like a tide, reversing the kind that rearranges the sand, leaves new pathways where there were once ruts. She thought of the moments that had trained her to contort the pause before the message, the thrill of a name lighting the screen, the way she tuned herself to his weather. Underneath, an older story tightened its fist. Be pleasing or be left. Be silent or be too much. The world had taught her a sentence with only two ends, both of them lonely. But another voice, quieter, truer, rose from the marrow. You are allowed to be whole and still be loved. You are allowed to walk away from noise and still be worthy of music. You are allowed to belong to yourself without apology. When the phone finally buzzed with a half answer, she felt the familiar twitch to prove she could be easy, undemanding, grateful for whatever came. Instead, she placed the phone face down, not from anger, from clarity. Peace is not passive. It is a boundary that does not need to shout. She had mistaken indifference for cool and chaos for passion. Now she could feel the difference. One empties you, the other steadies you. She understood, in the smallest practical way, that she would rather sit at a table set for one with her dignity intact than dine under chandeliers at the cost of her voice. It did not make her harder, it made her honest, and honesty quiet. Unadorned was the beginning of a different kind of beauty, not the beauty that waits to be chosen, but the beauty that chooses what is worthy of her life. The days that followed did not change the world outside her window. The city still pulsed with its restless rhythm. Men still made promises they didn't keep, and her reflection still appeared faint in the morning glass. But something inside her was rearranging. It was not the dramatic kind of change that sweeps through like a storm. It was quieter, steadier, more like the ground thawing after winter, imperceptible at first, yet unstoppable once begun. She began to notice how often she had spoken just to fill silence. How often her laughter had been an apology disguised as warmth. She had built so many bridges toward others that she no longer remembered where her own land ended. Every yes she gave to ease discomfort had been a slow erosion of her own borders. And so she began, gently, to reclaim them. Not through defiance, but through small acts of honesty. I don't have the energy tonight. That doesn't feel right to me. I'd rather not explain myself again. The words felt foreign at first, like shoes one must break in. But with each use, they began to fit. It startled people. The same men who once called her soft now accused her of being distant. Friends who thrived on her endless understanding began to frown when she no longer absorbed their chaos. But she didn't blame them. She had trained them to expect her availability, her endless capacity to smooth the edges of every situation. Boundaries, she learned, do not always inspire applause. Sometimes they invite silence, yet, even in the quiet, there was peace. One afternoon, she remembered something she had once read by Carl Jung. The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. She whispered it aloud, tasting the truth of it like water after drought. Becoming who you are isn't a sudden revelation. It's an undoing, a peeling back of every mask you wore to survive. She realized she'd been afraid of disappointing people because she mistook approval for love. But love that demands you shrink isn't love. It's hunger dressed as affection. She began to walk differently, not in posture, but in energy. Her presence no longer leaned forward seeking connection. It stood upright, calm, complete. When someone pulled away, she didn't chase. When words grew vague, she didn't fill the gaps with hope. She simply observed. If your interest is fading, that's okay, she would say softly. I just value honesty. That was all. No accusation, no guilt, no trembling need to be chosen. It was the sound of self-worth spoken in its native tongue. And something extraordinary happened. The air around her began to shift. The wrong kinds of men, the ones who thrived on her uncertainty, drifted away, as if sensing they no longer had a home there. Their games required confusion to survive, and she no longer provided it. In their place, quieter souls began to appear, people who listened more than they spoke, people who didn't mistake peace for boredom, people who could stand beside her without needing to dim her light. At night, she would sit again by the window, the same view, the same city. But now the reflection looking back at her was whole. She no longer waited for life to mirror her worth through someone else's eyes. The mirror itself had changed, reflecting not a woman waiting to be seen, but a woman who finally saw herself. And in that seeing, something beautiful unfolded. Not pride, not armor, but serenity. The kind that comes from knowing that love, when it's right, does not require you to trade your essence for belonging. The kind that stays even when no one is watching. There came a morning when she woke before dawn, the world still draped in blue quiet, and realized she was no longer afraid of being alone. The bed felt wide, but not empty. The silence, once sharp as loss, had softened into something sacred, a kind of companionship with her own soul. She made tea, barefoot on cold tile, and thought about all the years she had tried to make herself smaller so that love would have room to stay. How strange, she mused, that we think love requires space only when it is the absence of it that starves it most. She remembered how she once believed that devotion meant endurance, that to love was to bend, to wait, to prove patience through self-forgetting. She had mistaken loyalty for captivity, compromise for erasure, but growth has a quiet cruelty. It does not let you return to who you were, even when nostalgia calls you by name. Once you taste self-respect, you cannot stomach crumbs. Once you learn peace, chaos begins to itch. And once you've sat in the company of your own wholeness, the idea of begging to be seen feels almost absurd. In that soft dawn light, she understood that her boundaries were not walls built from fear, but gates guarded by clarity. They didn't keep love out, they let the right love in. The kind that could meet her not because she demanded it, but because she embodied it. When she walked through the city now, men still looked. But she no longer felt the old reflex to perform worthiness. Her walk had become an unspoken language, steady, grounded, unattached to approval. One evening, she met someone new. His voice was calm, his laughter unforced, his attention unhurried. He didn't rush to impress, nor did he retreat into mystery. For once, she didn't analyze every word or gesture. She simply observed, not from fear, but from presence. When he texted, she smiled and answered. When he didn't, she continued her day. It was not indifference, it was balance. Weeks passed. There were dinners, small talks, long silences that didn't sting. Then, as patterns often reveal, he began to fade, messages delayed, plans postponed, the familiar drift. The old version of her would have spiraled, crafting paragraphs to fix what she did not break. But the woman she had become simply noticed. One evening, she sent a message. Short and clear, I've noticed your energy has changed. If your interest has, too, that's okay. I value honesty. And with that, she closed her phone and went to bed. No pacing, no waiting for a reply, no trembling in half-sleep. The next morning, sunlight fell through the curtains like mercy. She brewed her coffee slowly, every movement deliberate, as if life itself were an act of devotion. There was no reply, but she didn't feel the emptiness she once feared. What she felt instead was alignment, the rare calm that follows when your actions match your truth. It was not about winning or losing. It was about being free from the performance of need. Carl Jung once wrote, "You are what you do, not what you say you'll do." She smiled at that. Because in choosing peace over panic, she had quietly rewritten her entire pattern. No longer the woman who waited to be chosen, she had chosen herself. And that choice, so simple and silent as it was, had changed the architecture of her life. There is a sacred power in consistency, not in what the world gives you, but in what you give yourself. The woman she was becoming no longer searched for proof of worth in another's attention. Her rhythm was her own now, quiet mornings, honest words, calm departures. She began to see how many people mistake noise for love, how often affection is performed through chaos, and how stillness can feel intimidating when you have lived too long in emotional storms. Peace, she discovered, is not the absence of feeling, but the presence of integrity. It is the state of not needing to chase clarity because you already live in it. When someone showed inconsistency, she no longer collected excuses. She simply observed the pattern because she had learned that patterns never lie. Words can be golden, promises can glitter, but behavior always reveals the truth. So she stopped polishing words that didn't shine on their own. She stopped feeding what refused to grow. She remembered how once she would confuse attention for effort, the quick texts, the flattery, the late-night messages that came with no intention to stay. They had thrilled her once, filled her with hope, only to dissolve into silence. Now, she could see how hollow that currency was. True effort, she realized, doesn't beg to be noticed. It's simply there, steady, showing up without fanfare, like sunlight, like breath. She no longer mistook charm for consistency, nor promises for presence. That discernment became her compass. It didn't make her cynical, it made her clear. There was a difference between closing your heart and protecting your peace. And she lived in that difference. When words and actions didn't align, she didn't accuse, didn't perform disappointment. She withdrew quietly, the way dusk withdraws light gracefully, without argument. Her silence was not punishment. It was wisdom choosing where not to spend itself. Some called her cold, but those who truly saw her understood she was not cold. She was composed. There is a vast distinction between the two. Coldness is the refusal to feel. Composure is the mastery of it. She still loved deeply, but now her love had shape, rhythm, intention. It was not a flood seeking to drown or prove. It was a river flowing within its banks, nourishing everything that deserved it. Her calm began to have a strange effect on others. Some grew uncomfortable, unable to play the games that once thrived in confusion. Others found solace in her presence, drawn to her steadiness like travelers to a lantern in fog. The right ones didn't mistake her peace for indifference. They recognized it for what it was, a rare kind of strength. She often thought about Jung's words. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. How many women, she wondered, are still calling chaos destiny because they haven't yet named it a choice? How many still rewrite themselves to be chosen, unaware that the cost of belonging shouldn't be their own reflection? As the weeks turned to months, her inner landscape became her sanctuary. She found joy in ordinary things, the scent of rain on pavement, the weight of a book in her lap, the small triumph of saying no without guilt. She was not waiting for someone to complete the picture. She was the picture, a composition of everything she had survived, softened, and reclaimed. And those she would love again. She knew love was no longer the goal, it was a guest, welcome but never worshipped. The foundation was herself, finally solid, finally home. There came a point when even memory began to soften. The faces that once haunted her, the voices that echoed like unfinished sentences, all blurred into the distance, not erased, but integrated. She could look back without trembling. Every disappointment, every sleepless night, every apology she should never have had to make now felt like a chapter that taught her the language of self-respect. Pain had been her teacher, yes, but it had also been her sculptor. It had carved her into someone who no longer mistook survival for love. One evening, she walked through the park near her apartment, the sky painted in late autumn gold. Children's laughter scattered like light between the trees, and she found herself smiling not at them, but at the quiet fullness blooming in her chest. This was what wholeness felt like. No grand revelation, no applause, just the quiet knowing that nothing was missing. She no longer searched for completion outside herself. She was both the seeker and the found. When she met men now, she no longer asked, "Will he choose me instead?" The question became, does this align with who I am? Does this honor the peace I've built? That shift, small in sound, monumental in meaning, changed everything. It meant she was no longer auditioning for love. She was curating her life. The desperation that once drove her to explain, justify, or perform had fallen away, replaced by a serene discernment. Some found that intimidating. Others found it magnetic. And the ones who couldn't meet her where she stood drifted off like leaves in wind. No bitterness, no blame, just release. She had learned the art of letting go without closing her heart, because love, when it is real, doesn't demand sacrifice of the soul. It coexists with freedom. She understood now that solitude was not the punishment of the unloved, but the privilege of the self-aware. Being alone meant she could hear her own voice again, the one that had been drowned out by the noise of pleasing, proving, performing. At night, when she wrote in her journal, her words were no longer questions of worth, but affirmations of being. I am enough. My peace is my power. I am not what happened to me. I am what I choose to become. Each line felt like reclaiming a piece of herself she had once given away too easily. Her reflection in the mirror was different now, not flawless, but real. The faint lines near her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the soft fatigue that came from living honestly, all of it was beautiful. She touched her skin and whispered, "Thank you for staying." It was a kind of prayer, not to something outside her, but to the quiet resilience within. People began to notice the shift. They couldn't always name it, but they felt it the way she moved without hurry, the way her gaze stayed steady. She no longer sought to impress, she sought to connect. Her presence was no longer about decoration, but about depth. And when she spoke, her words carried a new gravity, not loud, not defensive, but grounded, as if her soul itself had found its center of gravity. When she loved again, and she would. It would not be a rescue, but a meeting. Two complete beings choosing to walk together, not to fill a void, but to share the light. Until then, she was content in her own company, tending to her dreams, her art, her small joys. She understood now that the woman of value is not one who demands the world to see her worth, but one who lives it so fully that the world can only recognize it. And as she stood beneath the fading sky, she felt the truth settle deep in her bones. Peace is not what you find at the end of love, it's what you bring into it. If you felt something in these words, if they reminded you of your own strength, your quiet becoming, take a moment to share it, like, comment, or subscribe if this journey spoke to your heart, and pass it to someone who needs to hear that their worth is not waiting to be given. It's already within them.